It's 18 years since Concorde stopped scheduled services in 2003, and some in the aviation sector have never given up on the dream of restoring supersonic flight. In that same year, a company called Aerion was formed around a plan for a supersonic business jet called the AS2. And later, they said that they hoped to bring a larger AS3 airliner to market at much faster, almost hypersonic speeds. With backing from Texas billionaire Robert Bass, Aerion kept the supersonic dream alive, and in the last couple of years has seemed close to making this a reality. But then on May 21st, the dream fell apart when Aerion shocked the industry by announcing it had suspended operations. It hadn't run out of inspiration, it hadn't hit an insurmountable technical problem, and it hadn't been blocked by aviation regulators. Quite simply, Aerion had run out of cold, hard cash. Well, joining us to make sense of this largely unanticipated development is my colleague Kerry Lynch. She's senior editor with AIN, and she's closely followed the Aerion story for years. So firstly, Kerry, please just remind us of what the AS2 and the AS3 aircraft would have been able to do for air transportation.
Well, the AS2, Charlie, was widely believed to be the first supersonic business jet that would hit the market. It was to be an 8 to 12 passenger upscale high-end business jet that could travel at speeds up to Mach 1.4, beyond supersonic, obviously. But Aerion, understanding that there are regulatory hurdles to having supersonic, was taking a practical standpoint with this aircraft and designing it where it could be equally efficient at high subsonic speeds, still faster than what's available on the market today, and operate over ocean at the supersonic speeds. And they were having a hope of trying to convince regulators to allow low supersonic speeds, such as Mach 1.1 or 1.2, where they still emitted a sonic boom, but it never hit the ground, so it didn't affect population on land. The aircraft had typical business jet range, so at subsonic, it could go as much as 5,400 nautical miles, which is about the same as some of the high-end long-range business jets, and maybe a little less so, 4,200 nautical miles at supersonic, but it would still get you intercontinental range.
So pretty significant, really, in terms of what it would offer.
Yes, so it's right there in a sweet spot for business jets as far as range capabilities, but it gave the speed that many people had discussed wanting. Now, for the AS3, that's a totally different market. They were looking at airliners, a 50-seat passenger aircraft that could go 7,000 nautical miles. And they were looking at new technologies to get there, and it would go as fast as Mach 4, which is brushing up against hypersonic speeds. And of course, this was a much longer range product, and they had some patented laminar flow technology that they had been originally developing for the AS2, but I think they were pushing off for the AS3 to incorporate with that.
Right. Interesting. So grand ambitions, and at face value, you'd think that is something that the market would embrace. So why then do we think that Aerion couldn't get the funding it needed? Because as I understand it, it had some support from pretty significant aerospace giants like Boeing, GE Aviation, Spirit, Honeywell, Collins Aerospace. Weren't any of them investing in the program?
Well, that's an interesting question, Charlie. And the fact that these companies came on and were willing to develop products for the AS2, one veteran marketer told me that was a significant endorsement in the AS2. But when you look at it, these companies are operating in the same pandemic that the entire globe was. And so GE Aviation, for instance, a year ago had to lay off 13,000 workers. So it was developing the Affinity engine for it, and it actually had announced plans to build a family off of that with hopes that maybe there would be other would-be platforms. But once Aerion said they were shutting operations, they immediately discontinued work on it and reassigned their engineers and development team because it had lost its launch platform for that engine. There just wasn't money to continue going down that road. So it's a little hard to squeeze money out of suppliers, even if they are slightly risk sharing.
And that's a point, because isn't there a difference between being a risk-sharing partner where you're saying, okay, I'll invest the time, money, and effort to develop the engine for your aircraft, but they're not necessarily putting actual cash into Aerion's pocket? Because I think it was only Boeing that actually made a direct investment. Maybe I'm wrong.
Boeing and perhaps Spirit AeroSystems. There had been some discussion about that too. But Spirit last year, like Boeing, ran into the same issues with the pandemic. And there were reports that it had pulled out its support, but obviously that partnership continued. So it may have been under different terms, though. Now, the Boeing investment is a totally different story, and it's kind of an interesting one because Boeing wasn't the first major partner Aerion had looked at. At first, it looked at Airbus, and Airbus and Aerion had teamed. They'd done some technological sharing, but I'm told from people who were people who were close to the company that Airbus was the complete wrong fit. Airbus was interested in the technology. It was a good partnership. They did forward the technology, but Airbus was not interested in the business jet market. So they had different priorities. And now Airbus obviously is involved in hydrogen and all sorts of other things. So it was not necessarily the partnership that was going to get the AS2 to market. And then comes along Lockheed Martin, which has all sorts of supersonic expertise. But Lockheed Martin is a defense company. And again, like Airbus, their priorities are different. So as if it were Goldilocks and the Three Bears, Boeing was just right. However, the timing was just wrong. And when you look back at when Boeing and Aerion teamed up, it was 1 month before the second MAX crashed. That program was supposed to be a cornerstone program for Boeing's commercial activities. And instead, it came to a grinding halt.
So in some regards, I mean, this is a gross oversimplification to say that Aerion was sort of, by extension, a victim of COVID, but that was a big factor in terms of its backers' ability to stay on board, albeit there were other complications like the Boeing MAX situation.
Exactly. And COVID may have been a deterrent for the investment community as well.
Well, talking of that investment community, I mean, couldn't they have gone to other sources of funding? You know, in the electric aviation world, a lot of venture capitalists are putting down money, so-called special purpose acquisition companies. Couldn't Aerion have gone to those other sources? Maybe they did.
They did earlier this year. Aerion was indicating it was looking at that venue. It's an interesting question. As somebody said, investors are fickle. Right now, they're very enamored with the whole eVTOL segment. And it's very possible that it's siphoning off those available dollars. There's only going to be so much investment available in it. And there's a lot of Silicon Valley money in the eVTOL segment. And there's auto companies that want to jump into that segment. They would not necessarily be interested in supersonic. They're interested in what's sustainable. I mean, that's such a buzzword right now. Yes. So Aerion may have run into it. Somebody within the company had told me that they were agonizingly close to putting a deal together. And they could not pull the trigger.
Now, we mentioned the changing environment for air transport operators and considerations about sustainability. But the fact is that Aerion did have some significant backers in terms of prospective customers. So both Flexjet and NetJets, who are essentially private aviation flight operators, had committed to buying supersonic jets for their fleet. And I think that potentially those reservations were valued at over $11 billion. But it seems that even those funds, or at least having those funds potentially there, wasn't enough of a security for investors to say this is a good bet. I mean, it almost seems a bit unfair, given that some of these eVTOL companies we've been talking about, don't have any orders at all, and yet they apparently get all the money they want.
Well, when you get into the development of a business jet program, supersonic or otherwise, or any aircraft program, if you will, it is a very expensive venture. I mean, Aerion knew from the very beginning this was going to be a $5 billion program. And Robert Bass, who has stuck through it through thick and thin, at the get-go said, there is a limit on what I will put into this program. So they've known all along that they were going to need outside investments. What we don't know with those deposits, though, speaking to your question directly, Charlie, is how many of them were firm. For instance, NetJets came on board, I think, for something like 20, but they were options. So there was no money up front, actually, for it.
Yeah.
Flexjet was a very committed buyer. I think there's still interest in the supersonic market for Flexjet, but the investment community isn't a business jet buyer. They have to place bets on where they're going to put their money. And, Supersonic clearly is going to have to cross a regulatory hurdle. It's going to have to get the environmental community on board. And so there may have been questions there. I can only, guess at that. And you're right. Aerion certainly had proven the technology would work. It had, some of the best and the brightest and the most well-known and respected in the industry working for them. They were doing all the things. And as a matter of fact, Aerion even outlined this vision to have this ecosystem that worked in concert with the eVTOL sector. And maybe that was to try and tap in a little bit into that money that seems to be flowing so freely.
Yeah, good point. Well, so where do we think this leaves the supersonic dream that I was waxing lyrical about, Kerry? I mean, isn't NASA still working on a supersonic program? And I believe there's a company called Boom out there that has a supersonic plan of its own. Could they potentially benefit from Aerion's demise, or does this development spell trouble for them too, potentially?
Well, that's a really good question, and the answer could be right either way. Yes. So Lockheed Martin and NASA are working on noise research. That does not end because Aerion goes away. Even though Aerion may have been the company that kind of generated interest on the regulatory front, other companies such as Boom have also gotten a lot of attention on Capitol Hill to look at the supersonic regulations. So those noise trials are still set to continue. And as a matter of fact, they're looking at different technology really than what Aerion was looking at initially. And that is supposed to kick off, I think, either later this year, early next year. And the data from the noise trials that Lockheed Martin and NASA are working on together is supposed to serve as a foundation for perhaps new standards that will be discussed on the international arena at ICAO later in the decade. As far as the market, it's interesting because there's all sorts of different opinions about it. Boom was right on Aerion's heels. And as a matter of fact, they may be a little ahead of Aerion in some standpoint because they actually have hardware. They have what they call the baby boom, their demonstrator that's supposed to fly here before year end or maybe even early into next year to prove out their concepts. But their actual airplane isn't supposed to enter production for a couple more years. And they are looking at the airliner market. And that's where it gets a little dicey because you have to prove an economic basis for an airliner. And that's going to be an expensive ticket. And it's coming at a time when airlines are still going to be struggling to get back on their feet from the pandemic. And at a time when everybody wants sustainable. So some people believe that the Boom platform might be a bigger risk. Who knows? Boom does have some government money. I do believe that the U.S. Air Force has looked at them. So Boom has been able to get a few things Aerion hasn't.
Yeah, certainly I'm not hearing many airlines saying the one thing we need now to put us right is a supersonic jet. That isn't something that seems to be on the agenda. Well, okay, we haven't completely given up on the supersonic jet dream, Kerry, but I think for now we have to assume that you and I won't be riding to air shows on one together in the near future, and that's terrible because I'm pretty sure AIN was just about to buy one for our team any day now if this hadn't have happened. Kerry's working on a detailed background story about the Aerion saga, and you'll find that pretty soon at ainonline.com. We'll keep you posted on any further developments in this and every other part of the aviation industry. So please subscribe to our AIN YouTube channel for more videos like this. And thank you very much for watching.
Thanks for watching this AIN video. Please like, subscribe, and share it if you've enjoyed it. Also, visit ainonline.com for all the latest on the aviation industry.